The rain hadn't stopped for an hour, and neither had my daughter's tears, because the house I grew up in, the house my parents had just been buried out of, now had locks on the door that didn't recognize us anymore. My name is Claire Donovan, and this is the story of how my own brother threw us out into the storm, never once imagining what our father had left behind for me. Welcome back to the Family Revenge Tales. I remember every detail of that porch, the way you remember the moment before an accident, when your mind slows everything down and burns it into memory whether you want it there or not. The suitcases had tipped over in the wind, spilling Lily's little dresses onto the wet boards. Her stuffed rabbit, the one she'd slept with since she was 2, had rolled into a puddle at the bottom of the steps, and she let go of my hand and ran for it before I could stop her, soaking her shoes through in seconds. She held that dripping rabbit against her chest like it was the only solid thing left in the world, and honestly, in that moment, it might have been. My brother Ethan stood in the doorway, dry, arms crossed, watching us the way you'd watch weather you had no intention of stepping out into. He didn't offer an umbrella. He didn't offer a hand. He just watched. "You knew this was coming, Claire," he said, like he was reminding me of an appointment I'd forgotten. "The house stays with the sun. That's how it's always been." "Dad's been dead 3 weeks, Ethan. Mom's been gone less than that. And this is what you're doing?" He didn't even have the decency to look uncomfortable. "Daughters leave, sons stay. You left a long time ago, remember?" I could have argued. Some other version of me, maybe a younger one, might have stood there in the rain and tried to make him understand what he was doing to a 6-year-old who had just lost both grandparents in the span of a year. But I had learned, a long time before that porch, that arguing with Ethan was like arguing with a locked door. It doesn't matter how many times you knock, it was never going to open, and it certainly wasn't going to open for me. So I gathered what I could carry in 2 trips, buckled Lily into her car seat with her sopping rabbit still clutched to her chest, and pulled out of the driveway of the only home I had ever known. I had absolutely no idea driving away that night that my father's last decision on this earth was already quietly working its way toward my brother like a slow tide, and that it was going to take everything he thought belonged to him. To understand how we got to that porch, you have to go back further to a white clapboard house a half-mile from Lake Champlain in Burlington, Vermont, where my family had restored wooden boats for 3 generations. The business wasn't large, but it was respected. People brought their grandfather's sailboats to my father the way you'd bring an old photograph to be restored, carefully, reverently, trusting him with something irreplaceable. And my father loved that work the way some men love their children. Completely, almost without room left over for anyone else. I can still see him in the workshop on Saturday mornings, sawdust drifting in the light through the high windows, steam curling off a length of oak he was bending into a rib for some old sailor's hull. Ethan would be beside him, handed tools before he even asked for them, taught the names of things, the keel, the transom, the shear line, like a language passed down at the dinner table. I used to stand in the doorway, maybe 11 or 12 years old, and ask if I could learn too. "Not this time, Claire," my father would say. "Not cruel, just certain, the way you're certain about the tide coming in. A Donovan son keeps the shoreline." He said it so many times over the years that it stopped sounding like an opinion and started sounding like weather, something you didn't argue with, something that simply was. I remember the last time I asked, I was maybe 15, and I'd spent an entire week secretly reading a book on boat building I'd checked out from the library, hoping if I showed I already understood the basics, he'd change his mind. He glanced at the book in my hands, smiled the way adults smile at children playing dress-up, and told me dinner was almost ready. I stopped asking after that, not because I stopped wanting it, because I got tired of being told no by the person I most wanted to say yes. So when I graduated high school, I left Burlington behind and moved 40 minutes south to South Burlington, where nobody knew whose daughter I was. I waited tables through college, I took out loans I'd spend a decade paying back, one careful payment at a time. Somewhere in that grinding, unglamorous stretch of years, I discovered I had a mind built for exactly the kind of work my family had never once suggested I try. Contracts, numbers, the long, patient unraveling of financial fraud, it rewarded exactly the qualities nobody in my family had ever given me credit for having. Patience, discipline, the ability to sit with a problem until it gave up its answer. I built a small legal practice first, then a consulting firm. I won a case that made the local business journal, and a few years later, one that made the Spate ones. By my early 30s, I had more money than anyone in my family would have believed if I'd told them, and I never did tell them, because somewhere along the way, I had stopped needing the approval of people who'd already decided, before I was old enough to prove them wrong, exactly how much I was capable of. When my father died, it was sudden. A heart attack at the marina on an ordinary Tuesday morning, alone. The kind of death that leaves no space for goodbyes. I came home and did what needed to be done, the way I always had. I handled the funeral home, the insurance claims, the mountain of paperwork that follows death around like debris after a storm, patient and endless. Ethan accepted condolences at the service, shook hands, talked about carrying the family name forward with his chin lifted like a man accepting an award. Not once did he ask me what still needed signing or paying or filing. He simply assumed, the way he had always assumed, that someone else would take care of it. That someone had always been me. Our mother, Helen, lasted a little over a year past that. I watched grief hollow her out slowly, the way a candle burns down when you're not paying close enough attention. You look away for what feels like a moment, and suddenly there's almost nothing left. A stroke took her on a quiet Sunday morning. At her funeral, Ethan delivered a polished eulogy about legacy and tradition that mentioned her by name maybe twice. I sat in the second row in a black dress I'd bought for my father's funeral the year before, and I said nothing, because saying something had never once changed anything in that family. Afterward, in the parking lot, our father's attorney, a quiet and careful man named Charles Whitmore, touched my arm before I could get to my car. "Claire, don't leave town yet. Your father made changes to his will before he passed. I need some time to prepare things properly." I assumed it was routine, some small adjustment, maybe a sentimental item redistributed. I had no idea it was the loose end of something my father had been quietly unraveling for over a year, something that would eventually undo everything my brother believed the world owed him. Ethan didn't wait to find out what the will actually said. 4 days after our mother's funeral, before probate had even opened, he had every lock on the house changed. He had my belongings and Lily's carried out to the porch and left there like curbside garbage waiting for pickup. When I arrived to collect what I could, his wife, Vanessa, met me by the car, arms crossed against the cold. "It was never really Lily's house anyway," she said. Not cruelly, just matter of fact, the way you'd tell someone a store had already closed for the night. "You should have expected this, Claire." We checked into a small motel on the Lake Road that night, the kind of place with a flickering vacancy sign and curtains too thin to keep the parking lot light out. Lily fell asleep with her damp rabbit still pressed against her chest, exhausted past the point of crying. I lay on the other bed and stared at the water stain on the ceiling for a long time, trying to understand how a family could dissolve so completely, so fast, over a house and a name that had never really been mine to begin with. A week later, Ethan called, almost as an afterthought, to mention an old chest from the marina with my name written on the lid in our father's handwriting. He said he had no use for it and I could come get it if I wanted. I drove down expecting nothing more than some old tools, maybe a box of photographs nobody else wanted. What I found inside changed everything. It was an oak captain's chest, the wood worn smooth and pale at the corners from decades of hands. Inside, wrapped with a care that surprised me, were my father's antique brass dock key, his old folding measuring rule, a leather notebook soft with age, a stack of mortgage documents I didn't yet understand, and a single folded note in his handwriting. Ask Charles about the shoreline. I sat in my car in that gravel parking lot and read those 5 words 4 times before my hands stopped shaking enough to start the engine. Charles laid it all out for me a few days later, in his office with the particular gentleness lawyers use right before they tell you something that's going to hurt. Years earlier, Ethan had poured money into expanding the marina and building a row of luxury lake cabins that never filled the way our father had promised they would. To bail him out, quietly, without telling either of us, our father had mortgaged nearly everything he owned, the house, the business, all of it, buried under debt that would take a decade to dig free of. The only thing left untouched, Charles said, sliding a folder across the desk toward me, is 22 acres of shoreline, the old boathouse, the private dock, the maple grove behind it. Your father protected that piece from every loan he ever signed. He never once let Ethan near it. Why? Because somewhere along the way, Claire, your father figured out exactly what his son was capable of managing, and what he wasn't. He told me our father hadn't simply left the shoreline to Ethan the way tradition assumed he would. In the final months of his life, he had rewritten that portion of the will entirely. Both of his children would need to submit certified financial statements. The land would not go to the son by default. It would go to whichever child could prove, on paper, real discipline, the ability to hold that shoreline for 10 years without ever mortgaging it away again. For the first time in his life, my father had chosen responsibility over tradition. I don't think even he knew, the day he signed that revision, which one of us would actually pass the test he'd built. I think he just knew, finally, that he couldn't keep pretending the old rule still made any sense. I called my business partner Natalie that same afternoon. Within a day, our accountants had everything prepared. Years of investments, clean records, real estate, 0 debt. Ethan, meanwhile, filed his own statement with the kind of total confidence that only comes from a man who believes the outcome was decided before the paperwork ever existed. Nobody in Burlington had the faintest idea what I'd quietly built in the years I'd been gone. That had always been exactly how I wanted it. The morning of the will reading, Vanessa showed up outside my motel room door, holding a folder of legal documents and a small envelope, thick enough to be cash. "Take this," she said, holding it out like a kindness, "and a few of the old family photographs. Just sign away your claim now and save everyone the trouble of a fight nobody wants." I looked at her for a long moment, rain still falling softly behind her on the gravel lot. Some old, tired part of me wanted to feel anger. Instead, I mostly just felt sad. For her, for all of us, for how small this had all become. "Vanessa, I don't sign anything under pressure. Not for an envelope of cash. Not for photographs that already belong to me." She left without another word, but I noticed, watching her walk back to her car, that her shoulders carried a doubt they hadn't when she'd arrived 20 minutes earlier. The reading itself took place in Charles's conference room, heavy curtains drawn against the afternoon light, the kind of long table that makes everything feel more serious than it probably needs to be. Ethan sat across from me in a new suit, Vanessa beside him, both of them wearing the particular calm of people who believe they've already won. Charles began with the house and the marina, heavily mortgaged, worth barely more than what remained owed on them, and handed them over to Ethan. My brother smiled like a man accepting a trophy he'd been promised since childhood. He said, "A Donovan's son keeps the shoreline," he said quietly, almost to himself, the way you'd recite something memorized so long ago you no longer remembered learning it. Then Charles opened a second folder, and the room went quiet in a different way. He read our father's final instructions, slowly, letting every sentence land fully before moving to the next. The condition, the certified statements, the 10-year requirement. I watched understanding cross my brother's face like weather moving over open water, from confusion to disbelief to something closer to dread. Charles reviewed the numbers first. Ethan's properties, his debts, the luxury cabins that had never once turned the profit he'd promised. Added together, his statement showed a negative net worth. Then, Charles opened mine. Years of quiet, unglamorous work laid out in clean columns. Investments, assets, zero debt. A certified net worth just over $6.4 million. The condition, Charles said gently, has been met. By Claire. Ethan didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply went pale, his hand gripping the edge of the table like the floor beneath him had tilted, and then he sat down hard, breathing like the air in the room had suddenly thinned. Vanessa reached for his arm. Nobody spoke for what felt like a very long time. I didn't gloat. I didn't say a single word about all the years I'd been told there was no place for me in that family, no future at that shoreline. I simply accepted the deed and my father's old brass dock key, the one he'd meant for me all along, even if it took him most of a lifetime and a great deal of quiet regret to admit it. Months later, Ethan lost the family house for foreclosure. His attempt to challenge the will in court went nowhere. The numbers were the numbers, certified and undeniable, and no amount of arguing could reshape them. I didn't take satisfaction in that part. I've learned there's no real joy in watching someone lose everything, even someone who once left your daughter's rain-soaked shoes on a porch and called it fair. What I did take satisfaction in was restoring the old boathouse. I turned it into a small workshop and learning center on the water where kids from town, including my own daughter Lily, could learn woodworking and boat restoration and craftsmanship, regardless of whether they happened to be born a son or a daughter, regardless of what anyone's father used to say about who deserved to stay and who was expected to leave. The day we opened it, Lily used the old brass key to unlock the front door herself, standing up on her toes to reach the lock, laughing when it finally clicked open. Something in me settled that day, quietly, the way a house settles after a long winter. I understood, finally, what my father had been trying to tell me from inside that old chest all along. A legacy isn't something you inherit simply because of the family you were born into. It's something you earn through the choices you make when no one is watching and no one is keeping score. My father learned that lesson too late to undo everything he'd already broken, but he learned it in time to make sure I didn't have to learn it the same hard way he did. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own family, your own quiet years of being overlooked or underestimated, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the Family Revenge Tales. We tell these stories because so many of you have lived some version of them, and you deserve to see justice done, even if only here, even if only in a story told out loud on a screen. And if there's one thing I hope you carry with you after hearing this, let it be this. Your worth was never determined by the people who overlooked you. Keep building quietly. Keep your integrity, even when no one is watching. The truth has a way of surfacing exactly when it needs to. What is the significant educational or other value in this story? This story speaks to the quiet damage caused by favoritism and outdated family traditions, and how those patterns can blind people to real merit hiding in plain sight. It shows that financial discipline, patience, and integrity often matter more in the long run than loud confidence or inherited entitlement. It also demonstrates that justice doesn't require revenge or cruelty. Claire's response to her brother's downfall is restraint and creation rather than gloating, modeling a healthier and more mature form of closure. Finally, it reminds viewers that legacies endure longest when they're passed down based on responsibility and proven character, rather than gender or birth order. A lesson that speaks to real family dynamics far beyond the single story.